guys back into ancient history, into 2004. I was 16 years old. I was sitting on my couch on election night watching the competitive race between John Kerry and George W. Bush. And I was sitting at home, and I had a bunch of my friends over for an election night party, and it turned to 11 o'clock, and my parents told me that we had to send people home. And I said, can I please stay up and see what was going to happen? It was a nail biter in Ohio, and I stayed up probably until 2 a.m. when it became clear that we weren't going to know the results until the next day. And I went to sleep thinking, frustrated, that I'd seen on the news that evening that more young people hadn't turned out to vote and hadn't participated. I said I wanted to do something about it, but what could I possibly do? I was only 16 years old. I didn't know anybody important in politics. I didn't have any money. I didn't have a team of people I could deploy. But I heard about this thing called YouTube. And I heard there was this thing that you could use to take a film, to take something and actually put it out into the world without having to go through lots of gatekeepers and the people in Hollywood. And I thought there was something to that. I said, what if I made a movie to tell the story of this generation and why it's important for this generation to vote and get involved in politics? Now, of course, I didn't know anything about making a movie either. So I said, well, I'll just figure it out. So I went out and I got a camera and I taught myself how to use it. I went to Washington. I cold called a couple hundred senators and congressmen. The first thing I had to do, of course, was figure out how you got in touch with those people. So I went on Google and I typed in, how do you get in touch with a politician? And I found out there were these people called press secretaries and communications directors who you had to go through. And I figured out how to find their email addresses, and I sent them these very, very self-important emails telling them why it was essential for their senator or member of Congress to be part of this film. And then a really funny thing happened. Some of them said yes. And I went down to Washington at all of 16 years old in my suit and my tie, carrying my camera, and I had one of the most incredible experiences I'd had in my life up until that point. Sitting face to face with the people who actually made decisions and asking them, why is it that more young people don't get involved? What's at stake? And as I spent about 2 years going back and forth to Washington, going all over the campaign trail, interviewing everybody from Jeb Bush to John Kerry, I had this incredible realization that I, as a young person, had power. That as a young person, I had the ability to go out and talk to these people and hold these people accountable and ask them questions. Pretty soon, with all the people who'd been generous enough to be part of the film, as the election approached, we took the film out in 2008, and we did over 1,000 screenings all over the country. We ended up registering 25,000 new voters at events all over the country. I found myself on CNN. I found myself advising the government of Botswana on how to engage young people in their political system. I found myself sitting with people like Maggie Gyllenhaal and Olivia Wilde, who agreed to do celebrity spots for us. And we saw this incredible turnout of young people in 2008. And as I traveled around the country between the fall of the election and Election Day in November, I was really struck by the energy and the passion and the inspiration in my generation. Now, why am I telling you this story? Well, I'm particularly proud of what we were able to achieve, and I think it's a real testament to this generation. But I'm here to tell you that my story is not at all extraordinary. This is a story that is at the very heart of what is in this generation. This is a story of young people all over this country and all over this world who are part of this generation who have seized the ability to take action, to take their ideas, to take the things that they deeply care about, and say, why not? And to look around the world and to see the other young people who are doing incredible things, from young people who go from dorm room outcasts to some of the most influential people in our world, and from the young people in Tahrir Square who decided they'd had enough of their government and wanted to change things and led a movement to overthrow their government. You see that this is a generation that is not sitting around waiting for permission. We're not waiting to have all of the answers to every question before we go act. We're incredibly willing to learn and to do. And for the first time, all of the gatekeepers that have governed how we interact and how we think about what's possible for a young person have been removed. What does it take to start a business today in 2014? compared to what it took to start a business in 1952? What does it take today to be part of a movement to say, I'm frustrated with something and I'm going to do something about it? We've become much more comfortable and accustomed to the idea that young people can have power. And as it happens, that's happened at a particularly fortuitous time. Because this generation, the millennial generation, is the largest generation in history. There are 80 million people in this generation in the United States alone. There are almost 1 billion globally. In some countries, millennials make up over 2/3 of the population. In the United States, millennials will make up 1/3 of the population by 2020, over half of the workforce around the same time. We'll make up 1/3 of the electorate by 2020. We'll also make up we already make up one of the largest consumer forces in the economy. And this is a generation that has all sorts of firsts associated with it. We're the most diverse generation in history. We are a generation where 99% of people have regular daily access to the internet for the first time, something people have more in common than the fact that they eat, sleep, and breathe. We are a generation that is the most educated generation in history. And all of this is under the specter of a new way of thinking about the world. This generation is more globally aware than any generation has been before. The ability for us to know that we can be in touch with anyone in the world with just one click. The idea that we could travel somewhere else in the world. The idea that we are forced to interact with and be aware of other ideas that are coming from other places is very, very powerful. So for the first time, we see ourselves in a global context. We've also grown up under the specter of incredible tragedy and incredible world events that have really shaped our consciousness. When many people in this generation were very young, we experienced 9/11, which really came for most millennials at a key moment in shaping our consciousness, as people were transitioning and trying to figure out who they were and what their values are. Suddenly we were confronted, on the one hand, with this sense that we are not alone, that we're deeply interconnected with the rest of society, seeing the world come so starkly into our world and collide, and to see that there's real evil in the world and that there's something that needs to be done about it. But on the other hand, we saw this incredible response that people in New York, where I live, got together and they helped figure out how do we rebuild from this horrific tragedy. That instilled in this generation this deep sense of civic mindedness and community spirit, and a desire to do something about real problems in our world. As we've gone through our lives, we've been shaped by 2 wars, we've been shaped by a series of economic scandals and crises, a world that has been ever increasingly spinning out of control in the foreign policy arena. We've seen our politics and our politicians at their worst, almost never at their best. And what it's led us to do is really be a generation with this mindset that I like to call pragmatic idealism, which may seem at first like a contradiction of terms. Because for a lot of our history, pragmatism and idealism have lied at opposite ends of the spectrum, right? We've had periods of history like the 1950s where we've been very, very pragmatic in our thinking, where we're very, very focused on what's practical, what makes the most sense, and relatively simple in that thinking. Then we've had periods like the 1960s which were full of idealism about overthrowing systems and changing and creating revolution and bringing our world into an ideal vision. But in the 21st century, what has happened and what our world looks like, and the nuanced role of global corporations, of institutions, of governments, of citizens, has led this generation to think about this sense of pragmatic idealism. Which means that sometimes we work inside of institutions to create change, sometimes we work outside of them, sometimes we work hand in hand with them, sometimes we have to oppose them. And we understand this very well because we've seen it play out. If you care deeply about the environment and creating a solution to climate change, you understand that part of that solution will come through working with big businesses and working with corporations. If you understand that you want to make real educational change and change our education system in this country, there's in some ways no better way to start than by helping change one school or helping change one environment, which is something people in this generation have stepped up to do across the board. So when we look at our world and we look at the challenges we face, nothing is so simple and so stark. Nothing is a question of we can pick this option or that option. Everything is deeply interconnected. And this is the first generation to understand that. At the same time, our world is changing incredibly rapidly. We're going through something that I call the fast future. This idea that once we were able to say, the future, that's 40 years ahead. Things might look entirely differently. One of my favorite movies, the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey, and when it came out in 1968, people said, oh, well, maybe in 2001, 40 years from now, we'll all be living in outer space, and we'll have this giant world where computer-talking robots are controlling us. And they were able to hold that idea in their head, and they said, we don't know what will happen 40 years from now. That's a very long time away. Today, realistically, think about it. We can't even think really more than 5 years ahead without seeming kind of silly. So much changes in 1 year that it's equivalent to some entire decades. So we've lost our ability to think about the future in long term. We think about the future in short term. So much so that the future almost becomes the present. When the first Palm Pilot came out in 1994, it took over a year for it to sell 1 million units. When the first iPhone came out, it took just 24 hours to sell 1 million units. And I use that example to illustrate the pace of change, and not just the pace of the change itself, but how quickly new technologies are adopted, how quickly we integrate them into our system. And that, in and of itself, drives change throughout society. It drives the way that we talk. It drives the way we communicate. It drives how we think about relationships, how we think about work. Just about every single aspect of our world is being shaped by this transformative change driven by technology. Now, lucky for this generation, we're a generation that understands that change better than anybody else, because we were born into that world. For us, as we look around and see millions of advertising messages in a world with devices and technology that can seem to people of other generations to be overwhelming, we embrace that. And not only that, but we're able to figure out how to navigate it, how to take all those tools and turn them into forces for change. You're seeing a generation of entrepreneurs and innovators who are coming up with solutions to small problems and to big ones, who are taking frustrations and they're channeling them into billion-dollar or multi-billion-dollar ideas that change the face of how governments and citizens and technologists work and interact. And for a lot of people, this kind of change can be overwhelming. And I spend a lot of time writing and talking and thinking about this generation. And so I frequently go and I'll talk to someone in a big company, and they'll gripe and complain about this generation to me. And you've probably all seen various different articles criticizing this generation and listing complaints. And my response to that is, when you think about this generation, the largest generation in history, a generation of people, most of whom have not yet turned 30, isn't it a little bit early to suggest that this is a generation that should be written off, or that this is a generation that should be criticized or categorically dismissed? And if you're smart, you'll understand that this generation plays a pivotal role in the future of every single industry in our society. Not only are we going to be the employees and leaders of the future of every industry, we're also the customers of every single industry. So dismiss this generation at your own peril. Politicians dismiss this generation at their own peril. People in business dismiss this generation at their own peril. And frankly, people of other generations do the same thing. If we want to move boldly into the future, we should embrace this generation who deeply understands the future and where we're headed. Now, you may be scared about where we're going, you may be concerned, but the ability to actually navigate that world is built entirely around this generation. And what I see as I go around is a generation that is full of a feeling of inclusiveness, a generation that is deeply, deeply focused on building a better world, that's been shaped by seeing the impact of what can be done in a negative context. And this is a generation that very much has a long mission ahead. This generation is expected to live longer than any other generation that's come before it, based on the incredible advances we've had in modern science. And we're not retiring at the same age as the other people have. So we have a long, long vision of where this goes and what we can do, as opposed to saying there's one little problem we want to solve. There's one piece of flash-in-the-pan action that we're looking for. There's a much longer picture. We see causes as things that we'll be working on for our entire lives. So I'm particularly excited about this generation. I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be young. Young people have never had more tools at their disposal. It's never been easier to channel your vision into action. It's never been easier to go from being an ordinary person into being a truly extraordinary one. And if we want to make the most of the 21st century, if we want to move our country and our world forward, we'll do our best if we listen to this generation and we try and harness their power to figure out how we solve the biggest challenges of our time. And that's the power of the millennial generation. Thank you very much.